On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the U.S. labels China a currency manipulator and prepares to impose tariffs on Europe, and the U.S. win a trade war on so many fronts. And protests in Hong Kong brought the city to a standstill on Monday. What is the Hong Kong SAR government's response? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. Let's begin our show with the latest on China-U.S. trade frictions. The U.S. Treasury Department has labeled China as a currency manipulator on Monday after the yuan fell beyond 7 per dollar. China's central bank responded. The designation is an arbitrary, unilateral, and protectionist measure. Before we get down to the discussion about what's the real nature of the latest round, let's take a look at this.
The U.S. Treasury has named China a currency manipulator for the first time since 1994. This is after the Chinese yuan tumbled to just over 7 yuan to $1 US on Monday, its lowest level in more than 10 years. U.S. President Donald Trump even suggested on Twitter that the U.S. Federal Reserve should retaliate by driving the dollar's value down. The People's Bank of China responded that the U.S. move will greatly impact the global economy.
The move to designate China a currency manipulator is completely unfounded. It neither meets the common consensus of the global community, nor does it fit the U.S. Treasury Department's own criteria for labeling a currency manipulator, so we strongly reject the accusation.
China's central bank explained weakening of the currency is due to dynamics of the world economy and the escalating trade frictions. Meanwhile, stock markets around the world have reacted to the escalating trade tensions as the U.S. threatened to impose new tariffs on Chinese goods last week. Stock markets of major economies such as China, France, Germany, UK, and Japan have suffered heavy drops. And in the U.S., 3 major indexes, the Nasdaq, oil prices, and retail stocks, all closed in the red. With the U.S. continuing to impose tariffs on so many countries, there seems to be no end in arresting global trade.
For more on the U.S. trade war on the European and the Chinese fronts, as well as the latest front regarding currency manipulator or not, we have in Washington Han Chuan, who is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former executive managing director of the Institute of International Finance. In Brussels, Daniel Gross, director of the Center for European Policy Studies. In Belfast, we have Klaus Barres, who is a distinguished professor from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And also, we have in Beijing studio Cui Hongjian, Director of the Department for European Studies from the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. We have a very strong panel, so everybody has to be brief, gentlemen. So let me go to you first, Mr. Tran. Since you're a scholar on international finance, whose role is it internationally recognized? Whether one country is a currency manipulator or not, is it just one country like the United States, or is it the International Monetary Fund? Mr. Tran.
It is both. Both the IMF has a procedure to monitor and survey the foreign exchange policy practices among its members, and if a country engages in manipulating or suppressing the value of the currency to gain unfair advantages, the IMF will say so. But also the U.S., according to 2 of its laws, the 1988 law and the 2015 law on trade facilitation and trade reinforcement, also empower the Department of Commerce to designate the country as currency manipulator if it hurts the U.S. interest and fits the criteria that the law specified.
May I just follow up a little bit, Mr. Tran, since the 2 laws that you mentioned are domestic laws of the United States, which means any country at any time could pass laws in this regard and describe the other countries as quote-unquote currency manipulators, right? Is that the same logic?
Yes, but it is more certain than that in the sense that according to U.S. law, even if after the Commerce Department declare a country to be a currency manipulator, it has to engage with the IMF to have a multilateral consultation with the view to rectify the behavior that the U.S. deemed to be objectionable. And the remedies available for that would be to impose countervailing duties or tariffs, which the U.S. has already imposed on China.
All right, let me go to Mr. Gross, also economist. Mr. Gross, from your perspective, not necessarily where you're from, but rather just as an economist, when you look at the U.S. in May, declined once again to claim China, quote-unquote, as a currency manipulator. If you look at the IMF just last month, also has been suggesting China is not a currency manipulator. It said yuan's valuation was in line with China's softer economic fundamentals, quote-unquote. That is earlier, just a few weeks ago from IMF. So why all of a sudden one country, the United States, could claim China as a quote-unquote a currency manipulator? Is it fair? Could the U.S. also do the same thing with other trade partners?
Well, this recent move by the United States is really purely political. It is quite clear that China doesn't meet the objective criteria for being a currency manipulator. The Central Bank of China has been very careful in not letting the currency depreciate very quickly. China doesn't even have an overall large current account surplus anymore. If there's anybody who actually could be singled out on the global scene as being a currency manipulator, it might be rather the euro area, which has a very large current account surplus and which has a very weak currency inter alia due to the very aggressive policy of the European Central Bank. Of course, there's one big difference, which is that the euro's exchange rate fluctuates in free markets, whereas the Central Bank of China tries to keep the exchange rate somewhat under control. And therefore, it is more difficult to actually prove that Europe or the Eurozone is a currency manipulator. And it is easier, at least superficially, to say, the currency of China is not determined by the market, and therefore it's being politically manipulated.
I see. Thank you for your explanation. Go to you as well, Professor Laris. What is currency manipulator? According to the latest description, the current account surplus has to be not exceeding 2% of gross domestic product. That is certainly the description of not being a currency manipulator. Now, even with that description, very strict description, China within 2%. So where does the currency manipulator, this hat, comes from? Can that hat be thrown to anyone? My question to you once again.
Yeah, I think I agree with the previous speaker that it's really political. That is part of the trade war which we have seen between China and the United States for a long time now. And until 2013, it probably was justified to say that China was indeed involved in currency manipulation. Since then, that has really largely stopped. Of course, an autocratic government has greater means to steer and manage its economy and its currency than democratic countries. But since 2013, China has not really actively become involved in currency manipulation. We should also look at the fact that the Chinese currency has only declined by something like 2%, which is significant still, but not huge. When we look at the British economy, the British pound sterling has gone down by 9% over the last few months, and so that is really, still within the realms of possibilities. So I wouldn't actually get too worked up about that. We have to see that it's political and part of the trade war.
I see. Mr. Cui, similar question in a different way. If one country is manipulating its currency, who is exactly doing that? Some would suggest the Federal Reserve, just a few days ago, make the decision. And as a result of that, the US dollar has devalued, as we have seen over the past few weeks. That seems to be, as some say, a currency manipulating act. It's very interesting how people look at that. What do you think?
It's very clear, as some guests mentioned, that this time for these claims from the United States against China about China as a currency manipulator. It's very, very, clear political, reason. As we know, now for Mr. Trump and his team, they want to extend this trade war to other part, even to this financial sector. Another issue, I think that they try to find out some more legitimacy, basic for this so-called enlarged, trade war. But of course, I think even for United States, for American administration, we can find a very, very contradictory, information. Even as we know that last month, the Ministry of Treasury of the United States recognized that China is not a currency manipulator. So I think it's very political, and also it's an intention by the United States to extend the trade war even.
I don't want to give Mr. Trump a hard time because he's now based in Washington, D.C. So let me ask him, sir, another question from a different direction. Quote-unquote currency manipulator, once unilaterally identified by the administration in the United States, what would the U.S. do to the parties identified by the U.S. as the currency manipulator? There are two things. One is in consultation with the IMF, that you sophisticated illustrated. The other is, quote-unquote, to punish that country. What are some of the ways, quote-unquote, to punish that country? Sir?
Basically, according to the two laws, the U.S. first has to engage with the IMF to discuss remedies to the complaint. But second, the U.S. can impose countervailing duties to compensate for the impact of the currency manipulation against U.S. trade interests. But as I said before, the U.S. has already imposed tariffs between 10% to 25% on almost over all of the import from China, if the 10% tariff is to be implemented on September 1st, coming up next month. And therefore, beyond tariffs, the U.S. can really, the next big step forward is to invoke the International Economic Emergency Power Act, which allows the U.S. to really do things like freeze financial assets of foreign countries or foreign officials in the U.S., to sanction against those entities, in addition to imposing tariffs, things that the U.S. has done vis-a-vis Venezuela and Cuba and so on. So I think that the declaration of currency manipulator by itself, even though it has a symbolic value of escalating the trade war and multiplying the points of conflict between the two countries, in practice it doesn't change very much the status quo that we have at the moment, and that is tension between the two countries.
I did a little bit of research, Mr. Gross. Correct me if I'm wrong. There are two things that the U.S. government could do once unilaterally decided a government or a country is quote-unquote a currency manipulator. One is to exercise overseas private investment core, which is about just increase the $60 billion in order to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. Secondly, is to also exercise the U.S. government procurement prevention against that specific economy. Now, first of all, China did not get much at all, if there's any, from the so-called investment core, overseas private, from the U.S. Secondly, China does not get much government procurement from the U.S. one either. So some economists suggest, no matter what are the things you want to call China, it's an empty threat. It's a make-up to the latest tariffs that the Trump administration is trying to throw at China without explaining to international investors around the world.
As we said earlier, this is really a political move, and it has very little real implications, because if the U.S. were really acting according to international law, then all of this, what it's doing, should be subject to the WTO rules.
That's right.
And it's definitely not permissible under the WTO to just label some other country as a currency manipulator and then impose unilateral sanctions or other trade measures. What's actually interesting is it shows something else. the Commerce Department of the United States had to issue a statement which was objectively wrong. I mean, according to its own rules, China is not a currency manipulator. And this means that the vestige of independent, impartial administration which we had in the United States, that is eroding. And I think this is a more serious part of this event, namely that the United States entire political administrative system shows that it is no longer independent, no longer working along objective rules.
Actually, when I heard that, I'm sure our audience as well, there were, I would expect, long sighs from many around the world when you just articulated that point. If you look at what is really a currency manipulator, there are other descriptions. A country must have a significant trade surplus over the U.S., quote unquote. A country must also have a material current account surplus, and the country needs to have made a persistent, one-sided intervention in foreign exchange market. That is the label, quote unquote, currency manipulator. Now, let me go to you, Mr. Lares. 1988, that was when the law regarding currency manipulator was put out there in the United States by Washington. Since then, China was labeled once, but from that time on, China's foreign exchange regime has been changing dramatically if you look at it just the past 30 years. Meanwhile, you see various administrations coming from the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, as well as the Obama administration have been creating mechanisms to work with China to discuss financial issues, whether it is called strategic economic dialogue or strategic and economic dialogue, you name it. So now, without real discussion, but rather negotiation threats, will problems, if there were any, can be resolved at all?
Yeah, I think, the discussion has clearly shown that all your panelists are largely agreed that China, under the current circumstances, the current definitions, cannot really be labeled a currency manipulator. That was partially different in the past, but for the last 7-8 years, even longer, that has not been the case. So I think it is clearly another way of putting pressure on China in the trade talks. The tariffs, which are supposed to come in on the 1st of September, another 10%, are of course part of that. And in a way, Trump interferes in the negotiating process between the expert commissions on both sides. And he wishes to clearly resolve the trade war to his advantage. And the model is probably the renegotiation of the new NAFTA treaty with Canada and Mexico. And that really is generally, most analysts agreed, that was a bullying strategy, that the United States, the Trump administration, put so much pressure on Canada and Mexico until they gave in, though not very much changed under the new NAFTA deal. And probably the same strategy is being attempted towards China. But China is, of course, a much bigger, much more important country than both Canada and Mexico. And China is perhaps also prouder and has, more nationalism among its ranks, so that China is not being browbeaten that easily by the Trump administration.
China certainly
so
has
all these attempts to put
Go ahead, sir. Sorry.
All these attempts to put additional tariffs on or to label China as a currency manipulator, they are, basically just methods to get China back to the negotiating table and to get a deal to the advantage of the United States.
Therefore,
and while both sides are, of course, interested in negotiating, it is best to go back to the negotiating table and actually try to negotiate seriously rather than put mutual pressure on each other.
There is a very interesting thing. Is this the way to push the other side to go back to the negotiation table, or push your negotiation counterpart further away from the negotiation table? That is the thing. A personal heroism, quote unquote, declared in the Twitter doesn't really help with the negotiation, which is seriously about the two economies, two largest in the world, and about every economy, I guess, in this world, Mr. Cui.
Yes, I think
and both sides can do that. Both sides,
Mr. Cui, please.
For any dispute, even between China and the United States. But now the question is, we could not, I think for China's perspective, we could not accept any kind of a negotiation in Mr. Trump's way. which means give a very, very big pressure, and they should have more consortium with me, and I get everything, and they'll lose everything. So I don't think it will be the case for this issue. And of course, now I think from China's understanding, it's very clear that firstly, this currency manipulator issue will not be in the law of the United States. Just like also American guest mentioned, firstly it should go to IMF, I mean multilateral system. And then it will give us another, I think, a big lesson is for China, for any, even European countries, we could not accept any kind of extraterritorial jurisdiction from the United States.
That's why I want to go back to Mr. Gross about that. Now, Washington, of course, at this point, want to build as much coalition as possible to be bigger bargaining chips in the negotiation for its own interest. But will others join it? That is the question. With its declining credibility, as some suggest, and the very harsh negotiation skills, if not bullish, trying to be bullying others in real practice. Let's just assume it's the former, it's the better one still, not necessarily the real bullying. Let's just assume that were true. But Mr. Gross, for the European countries and other economies, from an economist perspective, what do you think?
Here in Europe, people just hope that Trump will not turn his attention on Europe. And they, of course, do not support what Trump is doing. But they are trying to keep a low profile because all they they want to stay out of this. And as long as Trump finds with China, he probably will not have the time and the inclination to put tariffs on Europe. So for the time being, I don't think one can hope for a lot of support for China from Europe. But Europe will also certainly not support Trump.
But if you look at the domino effect that some politicians in Washington wish to achieve, China, Canada, Mexico, Japan, South Korea, and the list that goes on. It's a very interesting reality. Let me come back to the four of you, gentlemen. From now on, what should we expect? Now, some of the bullying acts and rhetorics, will that be copied by various economies once it was accepted or not fought back? Are we going to see a much worse trade atmosphere in the world, not just between the United States and other economies, but also among and between other economies themselves, as well as a result of what's going on right now? Let me come back to every one of you. Mr. Chuan, you go first. To the extent that you can, I understand you're based in Washington.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that why many countries and economies disagree with Trump's tactics in terms of imposing unilateral tariffs and very harsh statements, he did raise fundamental deficiency in the trading system that we have to deal with. One is persistent current account imbalances among major countries, particularly the U.S. having current account deficit for many years and decades. And second, many countries have not really strictly implementing and honoring their commitments under the WTO rules. So whether or not Trump's tactics will be successful in the foreseeable future, the underlying problems have to be rectified. And to the extent that they are not, then we should expect continued trade tension, either from continued tariffs and heightened tariffs between the U.S. and other countries, and other form of competition and tension as well.
Some describe it as tactics, Mr. Gross. Others say if it sounds like a protectionist, if it did as a protectionist, it is a protectionist. It's not just tactic itself. What if something spoiled the whole soup?
From the United States, it's, I think, an expression of frustration. The United States doesn't do very well out of global trade, not because the others are doing bad things, just because the United States industry has been weakened over time. And therefore, Trump finds a lot of support for his protectionist policies. But all the others, China, Europe, Japan, Canada, nobody has an interest in starting or becoming protectionists themselves or starting another trade war. Therefore, I expect this to remain basically something which originates from the US, mainly directed at China, but in this sense it will be limited. The rest of the world will go on trading with each other quite peacefully.
We hope that will be the case. Mr. Cui, also final words from you briefly.
I think it's not time for us to discuss the issue of fair or unfair from Trump administration. It's a time for us to take some more action. I mean, to do something, especially for China, the Europeans, some other advanced economies. How could we grow up our own capacity to avoid any more dangers and risks ahead?
Last but not least, Professor Laris as well. Sir, your final thoughts.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, we have to recognize that the Trump administration is a unique administration, that President Trump himself is highly unusual as an international statesman. He really believes that he is the tariff man, as he says, and he really believes that the United States is being discriminated and unfairly treated by both China and even its European allies. And that view is not shared among other statesmen and economists. And I believe that after Trump, we will see an improvement of the international economic environment. But, you know, some of the grievances which both the United States and the Europeans have about China need to be addressed. But that can be done in much more peaceful, much more constructive negotiations than is being done right now.
We are running out of time, gentlemen, but it's quite a thorough discussion. Thank you so much from your different perspectives. Klaus Laris, Cui Hongjian, Daniel Gross, and Han Pran. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you. You're watching World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. Protests in Hong Kong brought the city to a standstill on Monday. What is the Hong Kong SAR government's response? Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. Tensions have risen in Hong Kong SAR. 148 people have been arrested so far. China's Hong Kong Affairs Office warns protesters in Hong Kong not to play with fire, saying violence is pushing the city toward a dangerous abyss. Take a look.
Violence escalating. The recent violence in Hong Kong has seriously affected the region's transportation, public services and people's lives. Hong Kong police have become targets of violent acts. On Tuesday's press conference, Hong Kong police said the protesters' behavior had gone far beyond peaceful demonstrations.
The nature of the demonstration has been changed from a peaceful demonstration to brazen criminal act. So the nature of the demonstration has been changed. For these rioters, they go on streets and make damage to the properties and also put weapons and hide some explosives. This has largely impeded the livelihood of our Hong Kong residents.
The police also said protesters beat up those who don't share their opinion and attacked police officers and police stations. And all of these should not be tolerated. The Chinese mainland once again accused anti-China forces of being the driving force behind the violence in Hong Kong.
Anti-China forces both inside and outside Hong Kong are instigating radical violent forces behind the scenes. They are coordinating, guiding and funding the radicals in Hong Kong. It is imperative to all of the people in Hong Kong to end violence and restore order.
In the past few days, some extreme protesters tore down the national flags, while dozens of Hong Kong residents stepped up to safeguard the nation's dignity.
They removed the flag here on Saturday, and they did it again on Monday, so we are here to raise the flag again. It's not just about Hong Kong, it's also the pride of 1.4 billion Chinese.
The demonstrations began over legislation that would have allowed the transfer of criminal suspects to jurisdictions including the Chinese mainland, evolving from peaceful gatherings to violence during the past 2 months. Beijing has voiced strong support to the Hong Kong government and police and said violent protesters must be punished.
For more on the latest in Hong Kong, we have in Hong Kong Lawrence Ma, barrister and chairman of the Hong Kong Legal Exchange Foundation. Welcome, sir. In New York, we have Gao Zhikai, vice president of the Center for China and Globalization. Mr. Gao is based in Beijing. Gentlemen, welcome to both of you. Let me go to you first, Mr. Ma. As a legal expert, how would you describe the relations between the SAR government and the central authority in Beijing regarding the peace and order in Hong Kong?
Well, basically, the law and order is within the purview of the HK SAR government, which means that it is within the purview of the Security Bureau and the police force. So Hong Kong has, under the one country, two systems, the law enforcement departments, which is the police, to look after the law and order in Hong Kong. So in that respect, the central government, besides national foreign affairs and defense, has no role to play in Hong Kong with respect to law enforcement.
On the other hand, as a Hong Kong resident, Mr. Ma, since among the three of us, you are the Hong Kong resident, let me ask you about that. How do you see the relationship or the way of working between the police force in Hong Kong and the current SAR government?
Well, I think the current police force is doing its best. It's been stretched to its very thin in order to protect the safety and securities of the people in Hong Kong. I mean, those people were committing serious crimes. They were committing riots, they were unlawful assemblies, and there were attacks on the police, setting fires on buildings, arsons, and fighting in public places, and bashing residents and citizens, blocking the roads. They've committed very serious crimes in the city.
As a result of that, as a legal expert, Mr. Ma, should these people be punished if they were committing the crimes as you just described?
Of course. I mean, Hong Kong is a place known for its rule of law as well as law and order. And it has been so many years, Hong Kong has remained probably the safest city in Asia, if not the world. So these recent protests and unrest in the society has really damaged Hong Kong's reputation, and it has seriously hurt Hong Kong people's current lifestyles and peaceful enjoyment of life. So as a result, these people should be brought to justice.
Mr. Gao, now you were quite active, even as an interpreter during the negotiation between China and Britain right before the return of Hong Kong to the motherland in 1997. One country, two system, that is a wonderful creation, many believed around the world, about a new way of doing things. Now, Mr. Gao, how do you look at, more than 2 decades later, what's going on in Hong Kong for this moment?
Well, first of all, the one country, two system was a genius stroke created by the former paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, and paved the way for the smooth transfer of sovereignty back from Britain to China in 1997. There is no doubt about that. Now, there are some problems in Hong Kong, chaos, violence, rioting, for example, and these should not be attributed to the one country, two system. These should reveal that there are forces which are bent upon damaging the one country, two system. Therefore, this is the time for us to further defend the one country, two system, and to make everyone believe in Hong Kong and in the rest of China and throughout the world that the one country, two system still remains the pillar of all the political system here in Hong Kong. And this will also give strength to the rule of law, and the central government in Beijing will do whatever it needs to do to make sure that rule of law and order and law will prevail in Hong Kong. Hong Kong cannot deteriorate into anarchy or a situation where people will fear for their life, or they will not be able to go out into the streets for their normal business.
Okay. Mr. Ma, I was not in Hong Kong over the past 2 to 3 weeks in which situations escalated, apparently. So you probably could tell me better than what I see on social media, because those are sporadic moments, one could say. What shall we see about the quote-unquote division of opinions among the Hong Kong society, which of course is quite diverse in interests, but hopefully all believe that there should be a good Hong Kong and a better Hong Kong? Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, the people are diversified because actually, I believe that Hong Kong is a free city. It's so free that it is subject to a lot of external influences. The media is free. The inflow of capital is free. So an expression of opinion is free. Association is free. So Hong Kong, being part of China, is susceptible to what we understand as color revolutions, where there are external forces combined with internal forces to subvert the proper governance of the Hong Kong government, as well as the trying to influence the PRC government as well. So as a result of this freedom of the city, external forces have utilized this opportunity to use Hong Kong as a base to destabilize mainland China.
Interesting analysis. We'll see how things would evolve to see who is really responsible for the chaos rather than the peaceful discussion coming from the public about Hong Kong's future. Mr. Ma, if I could, a further question. What do you think people in Hong Kong, if I could even generalize like that, see their current life in a way? Could they still move freely wherever they want to go? Can they still go to work if they want to go? And could school students can still go to schools to study? Can people still travel freely in Hong Kong? Can they still speak their minds, whatever their ideas are in Hong Kong, without feeling the threat of being beaten or being punished by the others who do not believe in the same ideology? It's a series of questions, but I think they're very important.
Yes. Yeah, this is a very serious political tide that it is flowing in Hong Kong, where people, the protesters, are taking on the stage, and they victimize people who do not share their views, or they do not cooperate with them, and they swear at them using foul languages. They bash them, and they damage their cars and properties if they come into their ways. So they are really hooligans on the street. And in the past few weeks, as we can see, the protests were mainly at night. But since yesterday, they have something called the non-cooperative movement, where they bully people on the train, they stop the MTR, they block the artilleries, block the highways, they block the tunnels, so that cars and traffics and transportations cannot freely pass through. That hinders and affected adversely the life of many workers, many employees, and to a certain extent students in Hong Kong. So I mean, you're right. I mean, we are pretty scared because we don't want to come in any direct confrontation or even come close to those people.
I see. Mr. Gao, you've been working as an investor, and you've been traveling around the world, just as many in the world these days, from China's mainland. Do you think Hong Kong is still attractive to you at this point?
I have full confidence for the future of Hong Kong. However, we need to do several things. One is absolutely we need to effectively restore rule of law in Hong Kong. And then there should be no more attack on the police officers anymore. Any such attack is not only on the police officers themselves, but actually they are undermining the rule of law in Hong Kong. And they are actually undermining the one country, two system principle and the basic law system. Now, the Hong Kong people deserve to have the law and order brought back to them through whatever means. There are lots of very complicated issues, but at the very core is respect of the rule of law, bring back law and order, and enable the people to be free from threats to their lives or their properties, and business to need to be restored to their normal operations, rather than, for example, reputational damage being inflicted on Hong Kong again and again, and people start to lose confidence in the future of Hong Kong.
Gao Zhikai, Lawrence Ma, thank you so much, gentlemen, for helping us understand what's going on in Hong Kong from your own perspectives. Really appreciate it. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine, or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for more insights across China and around the world. Good night.